WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Leaf Software Solutions, a local resource for software needs. Leaf helps businesses grow. More at leafsoftwaresolutions.com.
We're going to take a trip right now. Like we always do about this time.
This is a journey into sound. Break it down.
I'm Kyle Long, and you're listening to Cultural Manifesto. On this week's show, we'll celebrate Women's History Month by paying tribute to the women who helped build Indiana's punk, new wave, alternative, and noise scenes. In cities like Indianapolis, Bloomington, and Lafayette, women were writing songs, forming bands, and helping to define the sound of Indiana's musical underground. Their voices and ideas were central to the energy that fueled Indiana's punk rock movement in the late 1970s and beyond. And yet, when the history of Indiana music is told, those contributions are often pushed to the margins or left out altogether. On this edition of Cultural Manifesto, we'll focus on the women who helped make these scenes possible and whose influence still echoes through Indiana's underground music culture.
You had to fight to be a girl in rock and roll, and that's just the way it went.
We'll start this week's show with Joyce Fidler. Joyce is best known for her work with the Indianapolis-based band Abstractions, but she was also a member of early new wave groups like Lip Service and The Obvious. Let's hear an excerpt of the Abstractions' debut single from 1981. This is Why Can't It Wait? That was The Abstractions with Why Can't It Wait? In 2023, I spoke with the group's vocalist, Joyce Fidler. Let's listen back to our conversation. I wanted to ask about your early work in music. I know you've also done acting. You're a comedian as well. When did you start making music?
When I was I owned a record store, so you probably know
Wonderwall.
that. I owned Wonderwall.
Yeah, I've heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, with my then husband. I call him my husband, okay. Rex, and then my brother. So, that was just never my goal. I wanted to be an actor always. I had a degree in theater. And so it was sort of like singing was an easier thing to break into. Some people I knew were starting a band and they, were looking for a singer. And so I just grabbed a mic stand and a 12-pack and went to the audition and they hired me. But I was in my 30s. I was in my 30s.
Really? Wow.
When I joined that first band. Maybe 32, something like that.
That's interesting. I know you were in a few bands before the Abstractions, right? Lip Service, right. The Obvious. Which group was this that you're referring to?
That was Lip Service.
Okay.
And it was one of my employees at Wonderwall had a wife who was going to be the drummer in the band. So he was talking to me about her band and I said, I want to audition. So, I did and they hired me. But it was a tough band because some of the musicians were first-time players, like the drummer. She had never had drum lessons or anything. She was just kind of winging it. And I think I was probably too ambitious and too pushy for neophyte, band. And so I was kind of like, they brought me on and they already knew a bunch of songs. So I was like, let's go play, let's book our band, let's book gigs. And they were like, wait a minute, they weren't quite ready to leave the basement. And So we ended up breaking up as I pushed too hard, and they kind of resisted and wanted to feel more confident and take more time to prepare.
How did you get into new wave music? Is that something that spoke to you, punk rock, new wave music? Yeah, what was the entry?
Right, as that music was coming out and we were hearing it in the store, because one of the cool things about owning a record store is you got promos of everything. So we got to hear music that maybe wasn't being played on the radio in Indianapolis. And so, our very favorite band at the time was Elvis Costello and the Attractions when Rex and I started being in bands and performing. And so, yeah, we loved all that music. We sang several go-go songs in our band because even after Lip Service broke up, The Obvious had 3 women, 3 men, and we sang a lot of go-go songs. So...
Were you into punk rock at all, or how did you kind of view all the different things that were happening in music at that time? Yeah. I
mean, Indianapolis was blessed with all those really cool, fabulous bands, So I really loved then and still love pretty much all kinds of music. I was listening to Elvis Costello. I loved the bands that were playing at the time. The Race Records, and then my, keyboard player, Rex, was also in the Positions, and he was, and my brother played with the Positions. He played with Your Parents, and I loved the guys in the Zero Boys, and Latex Novelties was a personal fave.
And Joyce, you mentioned you were 32 when you started actively performing in bands. That's really interesting because it seems like you were just like a natural, that you just took to it like a duck to water. Is that how it felt for you?
Yeah, I loved it. But I have to say, there was always this part of me that was like, but I don't want to be a singer. I want to be an actor, And then I started the whole fantasy of, okay, we'll shoot a music video and then we'll get discovered and then I can start my acting career. Well, here I am, I'll be 73 in a couple weeks. And, I'm in probably the most exciting acting experience of my life right this minute. So.
And Joyce, you mentioned you were frustrated as a musician because you wanted to be doing theatrical work, acting, and you definitely brought a lot of that kind of theatrical presence to your work with the Abstractions.
Thank you.
You got a lot of notoriety for that, too. It seems like the band was written up a lot here in the local press. You eventually had a music video that aired nationally on MTV and on the Night Flight show on the USA Network. Tell me about how the band was received here in the community.
Well, the truth is, I think we probably were much less of a draw than some other bands, but the folks that liked us a lot. That's sort of how I can kind of sum it up. I always felt like we weren't quite outrageous enough for some folks who were hardcore punk fans. One of the things that worked really well for us was having so many gals in the band. That was very attractive at the beginning. And as we kind of pared it down and had fewer females in the band, I think there was less interest in our stuff. But I'm grateful for the folks who responded well to our music and who were kind of rabid followers. I don't think there were as many of them for our band as there were for others.
I'm particularly interested in the experiences of women in the punk rock and new wave scene here in Indiana because there weren't many.
Right.
How did you feel as a woman in this scene? Were you accepted? Were you having to deal with misogyny or any kind of difficult situations with the men in the scene? Tell me about your experience.
Well, on the contrary, I think I was able to exploit the attraction of being a female front person. And I did most of the management kind of stuff around the band. I was the one that reached out to clubs, whether it was in Indy or Michigan or Illinois. And Chicago, we played the Chicago, some music festival there. And I felt like people responded really well. It was hard for me to hear the rejections when people, didn't book us or didn't have interest. But Rex was terrific because he would always go, next. He would just say, we didn't have a gig when you called them, and now we still don't have a gig, but we'll call somebody else and, someone will book us. And somebody always did.
Let's listen to a classic new wave track from The Abstractions. Off their 1985 EP, Check It Out, this is Halloween.
These are tears of joy that I am crying. You opened up my heart and now I'm finding
That was The Abstractions with Halloween. On this week's show, we're paying tribute to the women pioneers of Indiana punk, new wave, alternative, and noise music. Up next, we'll hear music from Software, a unique, all-female Indianapolis synth rock band that emerged from Indiana's women's music scene of the early 1980s. Software's bassist, Julie Huffaker, has played a significant role in the history of Indianapolis rock music. During the 1990s, she owned the Irvington-based record store Malibu Trash, and through the years, Julie has performed with over a dozen bands, including the early Indianapolis punk band, Last Four Digits. During a group interview I recorded with Last Four Digits in 2017, Julie recalled that her first exposure to the local punk scene was a chance encounter with the Zero Boys.
It's kind of related because Marvin will want me to say his name, about Marvin Goldstein, Dewey Ramone. I lived at Lake Nor Arms, and his brother, for some reason, Sam, was always at our pool. I have no idea why. And I had a huge Journey poster on my wall, but I was also collecting Sex Pistols singles and Ramones singles or records, and I didn't have any other friends that were into it, but I was really into it, but I didn't have anyone to share it with. So anyway, Sam would come to the pool, and he said, there's this band called the Zero Boys that practices in my garage, and I didn't know about the punk scene yet, and there was the punk scene was already happening, and there were shows happening, and all the Heron art students were into it, and I didn't know about the scene yet, and it was like 1980, I think, by then, and these guys were already playing together, but I didn't even know about the scene because I didn't know anyone that was into it. And so he said, you got to come over to my house because the Zero Boys practice in my garage, so you got to come over. So come over on this certain night. So I drove over there, and I heard the Zero Boys playing in the garage. This is the very earliest incarnation when John was still in the band, John Mitchell, and I bought my first bass rig from him when he quit the Zero Boys. But they were practicing in the garage, and they scared the crap out of me, and I ran away. I didn't even go and knock on the door.
That's classic.
I was so scared I ran away. And then somehow I made my way to Crazy Al's. I made up my own outfit with a cream T-shirt, and I put I took pins off my Girl Scout thing that you wear over your uniform, and had little those little things stuck on it. I made that into I stuck those little pins on my cream T-shirt, and I was probably doing Quaaludes or something, and I went down to Crazy House for the, and I just figured it out somehow, and then that's how I met Mike, and then that's how.
And the rest is
Tufty
history.
and ended up in the band.
And now you know the rest of the story.
Scared of the Zero Boys.
Let's hear an example of Julie's work with software. Off their 1984 self-titled cassette, this is Plastic World.
It's so easy to pretend plastic world that we live in. Ways to God all surround us, closing in, they try to drown us. It's inside it. It's inside it. It's inside it.
That was the Indianapolis synth rock band Software with Plastic World. In 2021, I spoke with the group's founder, synth player, and vocalist, Lee Weaver. Today, Lee is a non-binary person, using they/them pronouns. But during their time with Software, they identified as a woman and were known as Marg Herder. Let's listen back to our conversation as Lee discusses the challenges women musicians faced in the Indianapolis rock scene of the 1980s.
I think the thing is that it's hard to imagine what it was like back then. The gender divide was huge. So that was a problem. You know, we'd walk into IRC or one of the music stores of that day, and nobody would wait on us. They would think we were somebody's girlfriend, right? I don't think I ever looked like anybody's girlfriend, but apparently that was the thing. The other thing is we played all original music, which you couldn't. You just couldn't back then. It was very hard to find venues. I think the fact that we were just so intent on being ourselves, it really worked against us. And women were not taken seriously in music back then. You had very few people, you know, maybe Nancy Wilson of Heart, some other people who were thought of as musicians. But mostly women in rock and roll were singers. So I think that the two things are, you didn't hear about us because we're not on much, because we played all original music. And the other thing is that we were women. And that's just was a tough sell back then.
The music I've heard from Software encompasses a lot of different sounds. There is that progressive side of your musical taste. There also is, though, a sort of punk, post-punk, new wave aspect to the group. Describe to me all the different musical elements that were coming together in this band.
Well, you know, like anything else, we were listening, right? We were listening to what was going on. We weren't even so much listening to punk, but punk kind of came out as something that was happening then, and I don't even know that it's ever really been described. But we had an idea of what we just wanted to be edgy, wanted to be edgier than any women's music we'd ever heard, or any music we'd ever heard women making. I mean, even when the Go-Go's came out, we were like, oh, come on, there's more of that, you know? Although I have great respect, you know, for their songwriting and for what they were able to do at the time. It's amazing. But it wasn't the sound we wanted. We wanted what felt like a serious sound to us.
What was your goal with this band at the time? Were you trying to get signed to a major record label? Was this more of just a hobby or something fun to do? What was your kind of approach to this at the time?
Well, we had jobs, but the goal was that someone was going to hear us and appreciate us, you know, and want us to play in bigger venues and help us get there, right? You know, my perception is it was so different from anything that was out there. I don't know that a lot of people thought it was, like, cool. I have more people tell me that it's cool now, you know, because it does represent a time, but it's also very different for that time. So we were just weird back then. I mean, that's, you have this band and Julie and the gal Tammy Decker who replaced her, and then later Susan, Lowell, now Colin, who joined the band. They're girl-looking female human beings. But Diane and Kara and I are not. And everybody in music that was female and it's still sadly true, right? There's just so little room for anyone who's not going to look that, girly rock and roll kind of look, that over sexual kind of thing. And we'd be up there wearing the same clothes guys would, jeans and a t-shirt, and maybe dress up a little bit, but not in any kind of real feminine way. And I just don't think it was understandable at the time. It just didn't compute.
Let's hear another classic track from Software. This is Trust in Me. You can find this song on an upcoming compilation of Software's music that will be available at Luna Music on Record Store Day. Cultural Manifesto will return with more music from the women pioneers of Indiana punk, new wave, alternative, and noise music after this short break.
WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Leaf Software Solutions, a local resource for software needs. Leaf helps businesses grow. More at leafsoftwaresolutions.com.
I'm Kyle Long, and you're listening to Cultural Manifesto. On this week's show, we're paying tribute to the women pioneers of Indiana punk, new wave, alternative, and noise music. Next, we'll hear an excerpt of my 2025 interview with Cynthia Hammond, Ginny Davis, and Emily Jackson of the Bloomington, Indiana post-punk band Sally's Dream. During the 1980s, Sally's Dream earned positive reviews from critics and a dedicated fan base, but the band never had a chance to release a full-length album. That changed last year with the release of Breaking Through, a 13-track anthology of the group's music. The release of Breaking Through was inspired by the 2022 death of the band's guitarist and songwriter, Chrissy Dickinson. Let's listen back to an excerpt of my conversation with Sally's Dream. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the 1980s was a time when women still had to fight for their place in the rock music scene. Did you feel that way? And can you talk a bit about your experience being women in this scene during the 1980s and what that was like?
It was absolutely a boys' club. There wasn't any other all-female band in town. We never met another all-female band until much later. And getting our feet on the ground, there was, laughter sometimes when we'd come into a club for a sound check. We certainly had a lot of interesting experiences on the road. But that said, audiences embraced us, and we always made friends and fans. And we just wanted to play music and create our own music. And so, yeah, there was a little bit of breaking through there. When people would first see us, like, can these chicks play?
We also got some guff from booking agents, like, oh, these photos are great, but where are the topless ones? Or we'd have guys yell wet t-shirt contest from the audience, just really sexist crap. But that is the world we live in. So.
And you all just fought through it. You tuned it out and just focused on the music.
Chris in particular had some lovely comebacks, but that we can't share here. He would scream from the stage, but we have to keep those private.
Sure. This is Sally's Dream with Breaking Through.
Change as I wait for Perhaps you'll be the first to leave, the last to show. A little late, not wanting to be alone another day.
That was Bloomington, Indiana's Sally's Dream with Breaking Through. This week on Cultural Manifesto, we're paying tribute to the women pioneers of Indiana punk, new wave, alternative, and noise music. Up next, we'll hear an excerpt of my recent interview with Debbie Jaffe. During the mid-1980s, Debbie and Hal McGee co-founded the experimental Indianapolis-based cassette label Cause and Effect. They also performed together in the noise band Viscera. In 1985, Debbie began recording under the name Master-Slave Relationship, an industrial noise project that explored themes of emotional bondage. Let's listen back to my conversation with Debbie Jaffe as she discusses the origins of the project. It's really a unique project. It developed into, I think, almost a multimedia project with mixing photography and music, and eventually went on to explore themes of S&M and bondage. But initially, it was more of a noise project, similar to what you'd been doing with Hal. Is that correct?
Well, it started when I got Hal's brother to do the drums. He actually just recorded drums to the drum parts of rock songs like Van Halen and Judas Priest and stuff like that. And I took those drum parts that people could listen to and not know that they're not going to listen to, oh yeah, that's Van Halen. I took the the drum parts and then added my own keyboards and vocals and made them into totally different songs. So my first MSR release was more song oriented. And after that, then I started getting into more, keyboard experimentation and effects and delay and flanging and stuff like that. But it kind of started out slightly more rock oriented, as much rock as I can do. And then veered into weirder stuff. But honestly, you mentioned the S&M and all that. It really started out as emotional bondage more than actual physical bondage or S&M or that whole, fetish subcategory. It really was more of a personal thing where I was just working out my own emotional limitations and problems. And then the themes of S&M and bondage came in through the visuals and stuff like that. Because, if you have a band called Master-Slave Relationship, you might have some S&M visual imagery, perhaps. And so I did. But honestly, the lyrics and everything were a lot more, at least they started out being more a personal kind of thing with me. Back then, even like the punk music and the punk bands were regarded more, I guess, favorably than what we were doing. Because what we were doing was just screaming and yelling. How can anybody like screaming and yelling? Oh my God. But the punks, at least, was kind of pretending to be musical. But we were musical, but, people think we're just nuts. They think we're just crazy. And I don't think they understood what we were doing at all. No. Because at least the punks, they were doing some form of rock music. And we weren't doing rock music at all. Pretty far from it.
That was Master-Slave Relationship with the title track from their 1985 cassette, the heaviest. On this week's show, we're paying tribute to the women pioneers of Indiana punk, new wave, alternative, and noise music. Up next, we'll hear an excerpt from my 2023 conversation with Lynn Shipley, a bass player and vocalist for the Bloomington, Indiana band, Amoebas in Chaos. First, let's hear a track from the group's 1982 LP, On to Mayday. This is Designer Jeans.
Child of obsidian, I never was. Your choices, artificial, sophisticate, official. The lighting is a ritual on an 8x10 glossy. You're green and pink and red. Try to be real saucy, but you just look cheap instead.
That was Amoebas in Chaos with Designer Jeans. In 2023, I spoke with the group's bassist and vocalist, Lynn Shipley. Let's listen back to an excerpt of our conversation. When did punk rock or new wave music enter your life? Was that when you went to Bloomington or?
Yeah. So when I was 15, I was, really into music and into a lot of different kinds of music. And I was, I was both an athlete and a writer, a poet, and a fiction writer. And I was interested in theater. I did a lot of acting in high school, and I met the person who remains to this day my closest friend, and he was in the Amoebas much later than we met when we were 15 years old. And he turned me on to David Bowie, and I really never looked back from that. And so he and I we did become girlfriend and boyfriend, but we knew from a very young age that we were, long-term. So he and I both went to IU the same time in 1976. And that was when I really started to become aware that there was something going on in New York, especially, and on both coasts. And we were really trying to figure out what was going on and could we become a part of it. And so, the Gizmos, obviously, probably in 1978 or early 79, I met Daryl Frazier, Billy Nightshade from the Gizmos, a bass player. And I became friends with all those guys in the band, and he gave me his old bass. And that's where it started for me as an instrumentalist.
You mentioned the New York scene of the mid-'70s that produced, the Ramones, Patti Smith, Television, Richard Hell, all those classic artists. Bloomington had a very early punk scene with groups like the Gizmos and MX80. There was something really unique happening in Bloomington, too. What can you say about the scene at that time? Were you deeply involved in it? Were you really
pretty
immersed
involved?
In it? Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned MX80 because I feel like they were a real influence on me. I saw them at the, because people sometimes will say, well, like, where did you play? Because the funny thing is, we weren't like a lot of burgeoning punk scenes. The traditional clubs or music venues, in as much as there were any, they wanted nothing to do with you. First of all, we weren't particularly well-trained, disciplined musicians, and second of all, the scene that came along with us was not something that a lot of people wanted in their club. But I went to the Monroe County Public Library because the Monroe County Public Library in Bloomington did host music, and they weren't particularly, they didn't differentiate. If you wanted to play there, they'd let you do it, and I saw MX80 Sound there.
On life's big musical highway, you never really know what's gonna come up next. So actually, you better look out. Hey, you better look out. Hey, look out! Look out for the roadblock, look out for the roadblock, look out for the roadblock, look out for the roadblock.
And that was really kind of pivoting for me to see this. They were really good. And to see this like wild energy at a library. And I thought, this is like an incredible thing. And then, as I said, I got to know the Gizmos. And so they were like raw energy, and you could just, wherever they played, whether it was a garage or storefront, which a lot of that sort of thing happened back then. It was just instant from the first chord.
To you, I happen to like the Midwest. I got nothing to do, maybe no special, sometimes not much fun. But I like the Midwest because it's gonna feel young.
So eventually, three girlfriends of mine and I formed a band called the Premature Babies.
Wow, wow.
We knew nothing about what we were doing. We had no idea what we were doing. We had 2 bass players. My boyfriend at the time was Jamie Severance, who played with the Jetsons. And he agreed to play drums for us if he could wear a paper bag over his head and not admit it that it was him. We did a lot of like home show stuff with that band. It didn't last very long. And then Rich Lamphere, my friend from northern Indiana, he and I decided to put something together, and that became Amoebas in Chaos. And a couple of us were quite skilled and educated musicians, and a couple of us were not. And it was an interesting thing. And then we began to really collaborate with bands from Indianapolis and Lafayette. We really sort of forged a partnership with Dow Jones and the Industrials and the Jetsons and some other bands from the last 4 digits. And they would come down and play in Bloomington, and we'd go up to play in Indianapolis and Lafayette. You really felt like people recognized that something new and disruptive was happening. And I think that big, open, anything could happen, disruptive energy was very attractive.
I'm speeding up. I said I'm speeding up. And then I'm let down. I mean I'm flipped. Oh. I get a charge from you. I feel young again.
Talking about the success of the band, not every group from that era had a chance to even record a single. Amoebas in Chaos released a full LP. You also appeared, your song, Designer Jeans, which I think is probably the strongest representation of the group, that song appeared as the lead track on the Red Snurts compilation, which is a very influential record documenting the Indiana new wave and punk rock scene. Tell me about recording the group's music and, how that was received by punk rock and new wave fans at the time.
By the time On to Mayday came out, we had already decided to leave Bloomington and move out here. So that really, that record was barely in the bag when we were leaving town, and that was 1981. But yeah, people were, we were surprised, and other people were surprised that we were actually making a full-length album, because I don't think anybody else from the scene at that time had done that. It was extremely difficult to promote a record at that time unless you really had some backing behind you. And Red Snurts, had Bob Richard behind it. And so we made the decision to leave Bloomington. And that actually, I made the decision to leave Bloomington, and was quite surprised to find that almost my entire band had decided to come with me. In the process of picking up and leaving the state that all of us had grown up in, we were pretty preoccupied. That record came out, and we didn't know how to promote a record. We didn't have representation, and we made a record, and for us that was like, hey, we made a record.
Yeah. How long did the group survive in Boston? And did you get a good reception there?
One thing that happened, which was unfortunate, is I had we'd been out here playing about a year when I had a pretty severe case of carpal tunnel syndrome. I had to have hand surgery. So that was, it was, it was hard to do what we were doing. And we had really bitten off a really major, project to move far away, completely away from all of our friends and our family, and, get a rehearsal space, learn what Boston was about. So we actually did pretty well out here for about a year. And then when I had to stop playing for a while, I made the decision to not do it anymore. I didn't have the fire to do what it took in a city much bigger than any city I'd ever lived in. The hardship, it's not the right word, but I can't come up with the right word, but the challenge of, hauling gear around, and quite honestly, being a female in a very male-dominated world was exhausting to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to ask you about that, particularly your experiences here in Indiana. There were very few women in the scene at that time. Was that a difficult and challenging experience for you?
It was a challenge. I will say that I had some really great forerunner examples particularly in the Dancing Cigarettes. Emily and Jackie Odie, and I can't remember Emily's last name, but they were friends of ours. And so there was 2 women and 3 men in their band. And our band, I was the only female, and I remain the only female in most of my bands since then. But I think, to be honest, in retrospect, it was probably a lot harder than I thought it was at the time. I really had I was a pretty strong female character. I had a single mother who expected me and taught me to look out for myself and take care of myself and not expect to have anybody open doors for me. I was kind of a smart ass and a bit of a fighter. And I was happy to take on men that behaved badly toward me in nightclubs, to put it kindly.
Sure.
And so, yeah, there were times when, you always get are you the singer? Oh, are you are you a groupie? Are you a roadie? And then maybe you might get, are you the piano player? And, just all that, sort of generally insulting stuff that you get used to very quickly. The audiences were sometimes, not particularly easy to deal with, and particularly in Indianapolis. The non-college town audiences were sometimes really hard to deal with. And I had a little dust up with an audience member at Crazy Al's one night.
Oh, wow. Do you remember the details?
Yeah, him and his friend, I think what was happening was him and his friend were I'm wearing a bass guitar and singing as well. And him and his friend thought it was funny to compete to see who could touch me higher up on my leg. Yeah, it's awful at the time. It honestly was not. I'm sure that I'm by far not the only female musician that went through that kind of thing in the 70s, both in Bloomington and other towns around the country. And so I just lost my patience with it and whipped my bass off and smashed one of them in the face with the end of my bass.
Well, that resolved the problem, I'm sure.
It did resolve the problem. Yeah. It definitely did. There was some conversation about, his mother was going to, sue me for breaking his glasses or something. But,
never happened.
If that ever happened, I wasn't at the address that they tried to find me at. Yeah, I mean, so that kind of stuff did happen. And as I said, in retrospect, I think that was probably more disheartening, disruptive. The disrespect was more wearing than I and most of my few female colleagues would concede at that time. You had to fight to be a girl in rock and roll. That's just the way it went.
That was Lynn Shipley, the bassist and vocalist for Amoebas and Chaos. We'll end this week's show with another track from their 1982 LP, On to Mayday. This is Emotional Blank.
Blank, emotion, emotional blank. Blank, emotion, don't try to think. Cerebral demolition, starting to sink. Blank, emotion, emotional blank. 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 Blank.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you for tuning in for this tribute to the women pioneers of Indiana punk, new wave, alternative, and noise music. If you appreciate the arts and culture programming you hear on this station, please consider making a donation now at WFYI.org/give. And check out the Cultural Manifesto podcast at WFYI.org or wherever you listen to podcasts. Cultural Manifesto is hosted and produced by me, Kyle Long. Our podcast is edited by Holly Summers, and our radio director at WFYI is Roxana Caldwell. Thank you for listening.
WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Leaf Software Solutions, a local resource for software needs. Leaf helps businesses grow. More at leafsoftwaresolutions.com.